Zoom recording, and I will open the webinar now. I've opened the webinar.
I was curious to see. There we go. Welcome, everybody. I guess we'll just wait a few minutes before we get started. Wow, we have a big crowd here today. Fantastic. All right. Well, hi, everyone. I'm Charlene Kripakavich. I'm the CEO of VIA Sport, and really pleased to welcome you here today. And on behalf of VIA Sport British Columbia, I'm so thrilled to have this information session on the province of BC's community gaming grants. So wonderful, and such a big crowd, and it's a very important topic. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that while you're all calling in from different parts of the province and different communities and regions, we are hosting this seminar and this webinar on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. VIA Sport is really honored to do our work on these territories as we strive to increase access to sport for all British Columbians. We believe that access to safe and meaningful and welcoming experiences are fundamental to the growth of our communities and to the health and well-being of individuals. And we're really proud that the province of British Columbia has invested in VIA Sport and in amateur sport across the province. And in addition to the community gaming grants that you'll learn about from Denise, VIA Sport also offers grants that are available and accessible to you. So if you are unfamiliar to the grants that are available through VIA Sport, please do check out our website at viasport.ca to learn more. So today we're here to learn about the 2021 and 2022 gaming grant process. And we are very fortunate to have Denise Mon, the Manager of Policy and Community Outreach with the province of BC Community Gaming Grants Branch. She's going to give us a brief overview of the process, and there'll be a question and answer period at the end. So we'll let Denise do her presentation, and then we'll begin with some pre-submitted questions that many of you have already sent in. We'll start there, and then hopefully we'll be able to get to other questions later on. And please do submit some of those questions into the chat room. That will help us facilitate those questions. So without further ado, please welcome Denise Mon. Denise, nice to see you, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course, yes, it's great to be here. Thank you for the introduction, Charlene, and thanks to everyone for turning out today. It's great to see so many folks who are interested in the program. So yeah, very happy to be here. Just quickly, I'll just kind of give a little bit of background on myself. So I am, as Charlene mentioned, I'm the Manager of Policy and Community Outreach with the Community Gaming Grants Program. I've been here since around September, so still a little fresh, but I definitely feel like I've learned a lot in a short amount of time. And before that, I was actually with the sport branch in government. So very thrilled to still have that connection to sport and get to talk to you all, albeit in a slightly different capacity. But yeah, it's great to be back. So I'm going to do a bit of an overview of our program, and I'm going to talk a bit about the changes for this particular year. Hopefully this will be a bit of a refresh for folks who are familiar with the program, and also for those who are new, it'll kind of tell you everything you need to know. As mentioned, we will save some time for questions at the end. I understand that a bunch were sent in advance, and Scott kindly sent those on to me. So I've tried to weave those into the presentation as much as I could if they weren't already being answered. So hopefully most of that will come through there, but we'll definitely have time at the end for anything in addition to that. So we have a fair bit to get through, so I'm going to start. I'm also going to just pop off camera. I share this room with a couple of cats in the cat tree behind me, and they like to make an appearance as soon as I start talking. So I'm just going to pop off, but I'll come back on in the end. So, okay, let's get started. So I just wanted to do my own acknowledgement of the traditional land that I'm speaking from. So I'm calling in today from Victoria, which is the unceded Coast Salish territory of the Lekwungen people, known today as the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. So as I mentioned, we're going to talk a bit today about what's new for this grant year. I'm going to go over some essentials of the program and get into detail a little bit more about the organization and program eligibility, information about spending the grant and the process to apply for the grant. Hopefully we'll have a bit of time at the end, so I'll go over our $5 million capital project grant process, and then I'll end off with some resources if you need to get in touch or want to check out some of the great resources we have available on our website. So just starting off, I'll talk a bit about what's new for the current grant year that we're in. I think we're coming up on really the 1-year anniversary of when the world changed for us in BC. You know, that's been the biggest factor of the last year that we've all been dealing with. The not-for-profit sector and sports sector has really quickly pivoted to continue to providing those services and programming to British Columbians, which is fantastic, and we like to commend you all at this opportunity. We've definitely heard though from organizations who have struggled, who've had to modify, cancel, postpone their programming, you name it, due to COVID-19 and particularly the challenging financial situation that many organizations find themselves in. So in response to what we heard in early spring last year, we adapted our community gaming grant program policies and procedures, and we're continuing many of these for the grant year that we are now in. I'll just go over some of those high-level changes, but really it's focused around adapting our program criteria in order to keep providing flexibility to make sure that organizations continue to be eligible for the grant. So one of the bigger changes, it doesn't really affect the sports sector, but we have opened the human and social services sector early again this year. Some sport programming does run through the human and social services sector if it's kind of more recreational in scope, so that might be relevant to some folks on the call. We have relaxed the operating surplus criteria for return applicants. You know, recognizing cash flow management has been a real challenge just due to postponed programming and receiving temporary government aid. And similarly, we've relaxed the 75% government funding limit for programs. You know, community and volunteer involvement has really been impacted, and that's one of the ways that organizations can usually show that other 25% of funding. So that's been relaxed for return applicants. And we've also relaxed the requirement for programs to have been delivered for 12 months at the time of application for returning applicants, and also for new programs that are addressing COVID-19 related community needs. We have introduced one new temporary COVID-19 response measure, and that is that our grant funding can be used to create new paid positions in 2021. And that's hopefully to help organizations retain the people that they need and increase their capacity. We also, every year, we update our guidelines anyways, you know, irrespective of COVID-19. So we've done that again this year. It's always done in response to the input and feedback that we get throughout the year from our stakeholders, from applicants, from our staff. These are really just policy changes and clarification to existing policy, just to make things a little bit easier to understand. So a couple examples of that this year. We've just updated our organization eligibility criteria to just provide greater clarity on organization membership and additional information on board of directors election and governance requirements. So these aren't new, it's more just plain language information about what it is that we're talking about with respect to organizations eligibility. We've also added a couple new subsectors for the sports sector to better capture programming. Just as we noticed when we introduced subsectors into our program, we didn't catch all of them, and we're seeing more sort of sport groupings. So we've tried to reflect that. And there's other little kind of tweaks like that in our guidelines to look out for. So this is the cover page of our 2021 Gaming Grant Guidelines. They are up on our website. Please take a look through. We definitely encourage everyone to take a look through, read from front to back in advance of submitting your application. As I mentioned, the big changes this year has really been around COVID-19, but it's always a good way to refamiliarize yourself before you apply. So I'll talk now a bit about the program essentials, really what our program is about. So we have $140 million annually, and we give this out through 2 grant programs. Our main grant program, which is $135 million, and that is to help not-for-profits deliver their ongoing programs. And we also have a $5 million separate capital project grant program that helps not-for-profits, particularly with capital projects or acquisitions that are a bit larger in size. All of this is funded through provincial commercial gambling revenue, and this is usually the point where people want to know whether that has been impacted with the closure of casinos and whatnot for the year. What we have been told is that our budget, we just are kind of operating on a status quo basis. We haven't been told that there's any impacts to our budget. Of course, as some of you may know, the budget has not been released by government yet. That's going to happen on April 20th. So until that process unfolds, we don't know with certainty, but we are definitely moving forward on a status quo understanding. So our grant program, it's not a competitive grant process. So all organizations who are eligible do receive funding. What this is meant for us typically is around 90% of applicants receive a grant. The last time we pulled our information, because we're not quite through assessing all the grants for the year, but we were actually a bit higher this year, and that might be due to some of the relaxation that we have been able to put in place. But around 95% of applicants have received a grant for our grant year that just ended. Last year as well, the average grant amount was around $25,000, and that really speaks to the amount of local community programming that's happening across the province. Typically, we fund around 5,000 organizations across the province. So the way I like to think about it is that in pretty much every community around BC, our funding is going to community programming, which is pretty great. So I'll just kind of go over a bit of an overview of what we consider our sports sector. So obviously, not-for-profits deliver programming in many different areas. So we've kind of carved our program up into 6 different sectors. This basically just helps us to organize our intakes and notifications and track the different funding that goes to different sectors. So for sport, what we kind of include is really around community-based and amateur programs for organized competitive physical activity. So, all the typical sports are represented here for both youth and adult leagues, as well as Special Olympics funding and seniors game funding also is provided through that sector. Programs that are really about primarily delivering specialized training to elite athletes is not funded through this program, as well as motorized sports, recreational or physical activity, like fitness classes, yoga, etc., are not eligible through this program. So it's really about competitive amateur sport in the province. We do have 5 other sectors, as I mentioned. I'll just briefly mention what they are in case you may be interested or are involved with some of these other areas as well. So we have funding under the arts and culture sector, environment, public safety, human and social services. As I mentioned earlier, this is kind of where the non-competitive sport or recreation and physical activity would fall under. And we also provide funding to parent advisory councils and district parent advisory councils for extracurricular activities in schools. So this year we've been able to put together a bit more information on just where the funding is going within the sector. So for our grant year that just ended, we provided over 27 million to over 800 sports organizations across BC. You can kind of see how it all shakes out here. Unfortunately, we weren't able to have a bar for every single type of the subsectors. We tried that and it got pretty messy. So we've just kind of included some of the ones with the bigger buckets of funding, and then the rest kind of falls under that other sports. And we do have a category for other sports as well. And we've also wanted to break it down kind of how the funding is going throughout different areas in the province. Kind of no surprise, the bulk of the money goes where the bulk of people live. So the mainland, lower mainland, I should say, and Vancouver Island are seeing quite a bit of that funding. For last year, over 91% of applicants in the sports sector were successful at receiving grants. The majority, vast majority, were really around targeting and supporting youth, which is amazing. 14% of organizations indicated that they had programs that were targeted for supporting people with disabilities. This is all self-identified, by the way. And 7% of organizations had indicated that their funding was targeted to support Indigenous British Columbians. And when we looked at how many discrete and unique communities were being represented, our funding went to 117 communities across the province. In addition to that, we also looked at kind of the request of funding that's made to us versus what we pay out. So last year, 70% of sport organizations that received funding from us got over 75% of their requested amount. This is actually slightly higher than the average across all sectors, which is great. As we'll talk about later, this program doesn't fund 100% of a program's costs. So this indicates that sport organizations have a lot of success in submitting applications that get very close to their requested funding and the maximum of what our program is able to provide. So we have a few different funding levels for our grant program. Local organizations can be funded up to $100,000 a year. Regional organizations can receive up to 225, and provincial organizations serving the whole province are eligible to receive a grant up to 250,000. So funding levels are not guaranteed for a program. And what that means is that we have a fixed budget and we are a demand-driven program. So we carefully manage this to ensure that we can support all eligible organizations. And the funding level is awarded really based on the size and scope of the programming that's been presented through the application, in particular through the demonstrated financial need that's shown in the program actuals and budgets. Okay, so now I'm going to get a little bit into the organization eligibility aspect. Oops, sorry, I'm just clicking things randomly here. Okay, so as I mentioned, this is a grant program that's really meant for not-for-profits. That is the sort of key criteria in terms of being an eligible organization. The organization must deliver programs and services to the community. They must have an open membership, which means that anyone with an interest in taking part and taking advantage of what the organization is offering can do so. We have a requirement that there must be a volunteer board and that has a voting membership who can be involved in those elections. And there must be more than double the amount of voting members to board members. So there's a broad representation and a democratic process that takes place. And as I mentioned, that the board members are democratically chosen by that membership. And 2/3 of them reside in BC, so there's that community connection, and that board members do not receive remuneration for their acting in capacity as a board member. An organization would be ineligible for a grant if it was obviously a for-profit organization. That's not what we're about. If it were a member-funded society, which basically means that the programming and services they put on are just specifically for their members. We don't fund political parties, political action groups, or lobby groups, nor do we fund any level of government. And same goes for facilities like education institutions, hospitals, provincially operated facilities. That's kind of an extension of government or are funded through a government arrangement. So applicants need to meet specific organization financial eligibility criteria to be considered for a grant. What this means is we basically look at your financial statements for the previous year, and we do this to ensure that there's basically a good demonstration of organizational sustainability and financial health, and to ensure that our funding is going toward organizations and programming with a financial need. So what we ask organizations to submit are their sort of revenue and expenses for the previous fiscal year, or the fiscal year that's most recently completed, a balance sheet for the previous fiscal year, and a budget for the current fiscal year. And I'll talk a bit more about this in a second. So program eligibility. So our program is really meant to support the programs. It's not meant to sustain the organization. It's really to have funding that's set aside to help with the delivery of the program itself. So for us, that we say applications must be submitted on a program basis, and that's really what that is all about. We fund the programs. So our definition of a program is that it's an ongoing service, activity, or series of activities. And again, that program must benefit the community, really be responding to the community's needs, and accessible and open to all community members. As I mentioned at the top, typically we have a criteria that the program must be delivered for 12 months before it's eligible. This is one of those criteria that's being temporarily relaxed this year for return applicants. So, we obviously understand that continuous 12-month delivery probably didn't happen for most people. So that's what that's about. Again, eligible programs must be normally delivered for 12 months. That's we're giving that a pass this year. The program must, however, be directly delivered by the applicant, so not through a contracted service or some other arrangement. It must be ongoing, so it's not a project basis. This is an enduring, sustained program in the community. It must provide an immediate and direct service to the community. And what we mean by that is it's not necessarily assisting other organizations or some kind of indirect benefit to the community. There's that direct connection. And that it must be accessible and inclusive. So again, everyone who wants to take part can do so. So ineligible programs then would be programs that exclusively serve an organization's membership. We don't fund programs that are about providing financial assistance or programs that are about doing its own fundraising. We do not fund programs that are really about just operating a facility or a venue, including long-term housing. We don't fund programs that are about vocational training. We do not fund programs that are delivered under a contract or under a funding agreement with another entity. We don't fund programs that are, as I mentioned, really about benefiting other organizations. And really what all kind of wraps it up is that we don't fund programs that do not deliver an immediate and direct service to the community. So as part of our application, organizations must submit a program description for each of the programs that they're applying for. Obviously, if we're funding on a program basis, we like to know what it's all about. So what that means is that we kind of want the sort of big ticket items when it comes to knowing what your program is and what it's doing. So we want to know who benefits, how many people benefit, what are the program activities that you're delivering, how often do your programs run, when do they run, where is the program being delivered, and how is it being delivered? So how are you making your program accessible to all people? In addition to general information about the program, there are some additional sector-specific details for sport programs in particular. These are included as part of the guidelines, but I'll just quickly mention it here. So basically what these are for sport is we're looking to find out how the program provides access for all people to engage in organized competitive physical activity in the community, how the program supports athletes and participants at all levels with a focus on skill development for amateur athletes. And we also like to know the number of participants that are registered in each program activity over the past 12 months. So if you have a fall league and a spring league or Learn To program, so how many people are taking part in each of those discrete programs. I'll just pause here and I'll say that, participation levels last year were definitely impacted. So what we're going to be doing for this year is that, we want people to tell us, what they delivered last year and how many people took part, but we will consider the previous year participation numbers as well. So for return applicants, participant information will be reviewed from previous applications to kind of get a sense of what is normal. And for new applicants, you can provide that historical participation information in your program description as well, just for that extra context. Yeah, so, and on that matter, it would be really helpful in program descriptions for this year if organizations can talk about how your programs were impacted and what you were able to do, and what you were able to deliver and how you were able to deliver it over the past 12 months. So it really is that factual account of what you've done in the past 12 months, which is going to be a bit of an indication on what you plan on doing in the future. Also in the online application, applicants in the sports sector are required to provide the total number of participants that were registered over the past 12 months. So this is kind of the total number of unique participants across sort of the entire programming that you do. Obviously, if you have somebody who's super keen, they might be taking part in your fall league, in your spring league, in other types of programming you have, you would only count that person one time in that sort of total number of people who are participating in the past 12 months. Okay. In addition to the organization financial eligibility, applicants must also supply program financials in order for us to determine the program's financial eligibility. So program revenue and expense statements for the previous fiscal year and a program budget for the current fiscal year are required for each program that the organization is requesting funding for. One of the program financial criteria is that government funding cannot exceed 75% of the total program cost. And one of the main reasons for this is to see that demonstrated community support for the program. So applicants must have at least 25% of their program operating costs coming from non-government sources. This can be through user fees, fundraising, in-kind contributions, and so on. And if government funding exceeds the 75% threshold, then funding may be limited or denied. Again, here you see that sort of caveat for this year for return applicants who've had their program funding impacted, maybe through reduction in donations or revenues or an increase in emergency funding, their funding levels won't be impacted this year. So I've mentioned a few different financial documents on both the organization side and the program side of things. So this is just kind of a summary snapshot of the financial documents that we request. So again, on the organization side, we're looking for the organization's balance sheet for the most recently completed fiscal year. We're also looking for the organization's revenue and expense statement, otherwise known as the actuals, for the most recently completed fiscal year, and the organization's budget for the current fiscal year. And on the program side, for each of the programs that an organization is applying for funding, we're also looking for the program revenue and expense statement, or the actuals, for the most recently completed fiscal year, program budget for the current fiscal year. And if an organization is claiming in-kind contributions, to provide an in-kind contribution summary for the most recently completed fiscal year. So some of the timing points sometimes trip people up. So I've provided a couple of examples here just to give a scenario of what recently completed means vis-a-vis the sport intake in the organization's fiscal year. So in this example here, we've got our sport intake, which runs from March 1st to May 31st. So it's now open. It's been open for about 10 days now. And in this example, the organization's fiscal year runs from January 1st to December 31st, so the calendar year. So say an organization gets their things together, they want to apply on April 1st. What that would mean is that the most recently completed fiscal year would be that previous calendar year from January to December. So the organization and the program level actuals would be to cover that period. And the program budget would be for the current fiscal year, which began in January. So it would cover that period. It goes beyond the slide, but starting in January, that's going to take you all the way to December. So the budget should really show how the grant would be spent within that period. And I'll talk about this more in a bit, but funding can be spent up to 12 months from when the funding was received. And funding can also be used for costs that were incurred within the same fiscal year that the grant was received. So in this example, say funding is awarded to the organization on May 1st, they can spend that funding for another 12 months up to May 1st of 2022, or they can spend it back or reimburse costs that were incurred between January 1st and May 1st. So there's actually more than a 12-month period that an organization could spend the funding depending on where they're at in their fiscal year and when they received the funding. So another example here, just using a different fiscal year. Some folks run to from April to March 31st. So same thing again, the organization applies in April 1st. Technically, they are now in their new fiscal year. So their most recently completed fiscal year would end that March 31st. So we would be expecting to see the financials that cover that period. A lot of organizations aren't quite ready with their finalized statements just yet. That's fine. They can provide draft or internal financial statements, but what we wouldn't accept is just not getting them at all or for the incorrect fiscal year. So in this instance, you could apply right on April 1st, or you can wait until you have those in hand when all the things are kind of in better shape. But yes, we do require your actuals for your previous fiscal year, even if that fiscal year just ended the day before. And then I'll just give one other example here. So this, again, we're talking about the same fiscal year, but say you've got someone that's super keen and they wanted to apply on March 1st, so right as it opened. So technically the 2020-2021 is their current fiscal year. So their previous fiscal year would actually be from April 1st of 2019 to March 31st of 2020. So in this instance, we'd be looking for those actuals from quite some time ago. And then what we'd be looking for the program budget, we do say current fiscal year. But ideally, this would probably be for something like the I guess in this case, future fiscal year from April 1st of 2021. And although you are still in the current grant year, the fiscal year of 2020-2021, there's only a month left. So assuming you intend to spend that grant for future expenses, ideally you would be showing us your future program budget. Hopefully that all makes sense. I know that can be a little bit tricky if you're not financially minded like myself. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about now on what you can spend the grant on. So our grant funds are really to cover costs that are essential to the direct delivery of an approved program. So this can include things like wages, rent and utilities, program supplies that are needed for delivering the program, the rental or purchase of equipment that's needed for the direct delivery of your program. Some travel is included as part of your delivery. If you're doing sport programming, assuming you're traveling around the province to compete against other folks or take part in tournaments, that would be covered. Out of province travel can be covered as well, though there is a separate process to approve that. I suspect that's not really happening at the moment, however. But all this to say, the grant funds are really about covering costs that are essential to the direct delivery of that approved program. The grant funds are not intended to fund the organization's core operating costs. That said, you can prorate core organization operating costs if they are related to the direct delivery of your program. So an example that we give, just to spell this out, is if you have an employee that they do many things, they work on the programs, sometimes they work on other aspects of your organization that might not be around that direct delivery of the program. The example we have here, an employee spends 40% of their time working on an eligible program. This is an arts and culture example. So the eligible program would be a museum display. 60% of the time they work on non-eligible programs or on organizational or administrative duties. So in this instance, 40% of the employee's wage could be included as a prorated program expense. So yeah, we do realize that people, it's not all or nothing. If you have somebody who's doing several different things in your organization and some of it is related to that program cost, those can be included as a prorated cost. In addition to regular program funding, applicants can request funding for minor capital project funding as well as smaller capital acquisitions. So our definition for these is that a minor capital project would be under $20,000. It must be something that is essential for the delivery of that approved program. So this could be things like small renovations. Capital acquisitions, again, are required for you to be able to deliver your approved program. We do require quotes if it's over $5,000. Some of the things that we've been able to fund or help fund are things like computer equipment, sport equipment, things like that. Organizations can't apply for minor capital projects or capital acquisitions alone. They must be part of an ongoing program. So you would request that along with your regular program application. And if you haven't been awarded money specifically for minor capital projects or capital acquisitions, you must spend the funding that you receive on program delivery. So when we do award those amounts for these particular things, they must be used for those particular things. So organizations must have a separate account to receive, hold, and disperse the gaming funds that are given to them. All expenses should be paid directly from this gaming account. The funds may be transferred from the gaming account to a general account or reimbursed for eligible program expenses. That's kind of up to you. For us, we prefer if everything runs through the gaming account, as that's just the cleanest way of doing things, but we recognize that, you know, folks are able to do that how they like. This can be done through check or a board approved electronic transfer. And like everything, invoices and receipts must be retained for 5 years. As I mentioned a couple minutes ago, just around the spending timelines, you can spend your grant funds within 12 months of receiving them forward, or you can back pay expenses that were incurred in the same fiscal year that the grant was received. So in some instances, you may have more than 12 months to spend the grant funding. The only real reporting piece that we have is our gaming account summary report. And basically that's where organizations will account for all the funding that they've received and spent within that year. It must be submitted within 90 days of the organization's fiscal year end. And it really just gives us the accounting of what you had in your account at the beginning of the year, grants that you received, funds you dispersed, and then the balance at the end of the year. There's also a small portion dedicated to just letting us know the sort of impacts of the funding that you had and what you were able to do over that year. So that's the gaming account summary report. And then applying for the grant. So as I mentioned, the sport intake is from March 1st to May 31st. We do our best to notify applicants by September 30th. We do get a lot of applications at the very, very end of the intake, which can sometimes make that a little bit challenging, but we do our best. All of our applications must be done through our website. We don't accept any paper applications. And some of the documentation that I had mentioned, it must be attached to the application, or it can be emailed in after the fact. But again, we don't accept that physical mail. And before you apply, I made a plug for it earlier, but it really is valuable to review those program guidelines for the year, as well as the resources on our website. We've got tons of great stuff. There's pre-application checklists. We've got sample financial statements to look over, lots of frequently asked questions, as well as application tutorials. So if your application is denied or you'd like to request that the branch reconsiders their decision, we do have a process for that. That's called a reconsideration request. The request must be made within 30 days of notification, and it must state the reason why the decision should be varied or overturned. We don't look at new information or documents at that time. It's really just to make sure that the original decision was administratively fair, there wasn't any misinterpretations. And a final decision is made within 90 days of receiving the request. So here's some kind of general tips and advice for applying. I think the biggest things are really, tips to submit a good application is making sure that you do have clear financial statements. I mentioned a moment ago about the templates on our website. It's definitely worth checking those out, or even better if you can, to have a professional review your financials. An informative and easy to understand program description goes a long way. It answers all the questions that we might have and provides that important context and detail. Any outstanding issues from previous applications, if they've been identified on your notification letter, you definitely want to do your best to have those resolved by the time you apply for the next year. And definitely make sure you have that gaming account summary report submitted before you apply. Our application processing time typically is around 12 weeks. It really depends on who else is applying around the same time as you. That's one of the reasons why we say to apply as early as possible, because we do assess in the order that we receive the application. So the earlier you get in the queue, the earlier you get a response. We don't have too much time to go over the capital project because I do want to leave time for questions, but I'll just quickly go through and I'll just mention that we do presentations for the capital project grant as well. So if you are interested in it, definitely check back on our website and we'll have some more information on when we would be holding those sessions. So this is about larger capital projects that a not-for-profit might have, with a total project cost between $20,000 and $1.25 million. Between 20 and 50% of the total cost of a project may be funded through our program, and we provide grants up to a maximum of $250,000. This is a competitive process, and we do require matching funds from the applicant organization. And we have a total pot of $5 million annually for this, and it is quite competitive. So organizations are definitely encouraged to do their homework and put together the most competitive application that they can possibly make. We do not have our intake period yet for the year. This typically does happen around the summertime, so just to keep that in the back of your head. Only one application can be submitted for a capital project per year. So you really have to think, if you have a few things you'd like to accomplish, you kind of have to pick one and stick with that, because what we want to be able to fund is a complete project, not a bunch of half-finished projects. You can still apply for your regular community gaming grants. They're totally separate programs, so there's not an impact on one or the other. And we do have a sector guideline that we update every year that has much more in-depth information about that particular grant. We're just working on updating that for this year, so it's not out yet. And quickly, the three types of projects that are funded are facilities. So for an organization's own facilities, community infrastructure projects. So this would be about public amenities that are on public lands. And acquisition, so fixed capital assets that an organization would purchase and acquire and be in their use. As I mentioned, we do have that competitive scoring process. So this is just a quick breakdown of what that looks like. So we look at the community benefit, demonstrating that the project will be open and inclusive and accessible to everyone. The sort of project feasibility in terms of the timeline and permits and things like that, as well as the project considerations, project budget, how are you planning on spending the funds? Do you have the matching funds? And as well as a small portion for environmental efficiency. Okay, so I have now taken us through a lot. It's been a whirlwind. There is a lot more of this information on our website, as I mentioned. Definitely worth taking a look. That's where our program guidelines are as well. We do have staff who are available to answer questions every day of the week. We have a general email inbox, or we have a phone line that you can call if you have questions. As well as an outreach inbox that I manage, as well as our policy analyst. You can reach me that way too. And we also work with two other organizations that help organizations with applications and also put on their own presentations. So that's the BC Association of Charitable Gaming. They're a wonderful resource, so I would encourage you to reach out to them as well as the BC Association of Aboriginal Friendship Centers. We kind of have the same mandate, but more specific to Indigenous organizations. So those guys are there as well. And there are community charitable gaming associations in the province. There may be one in your community, so you can definitely reach out to them, and they can give you that that personalized help with your application or any questions that you might have. All right, I'll flip back to these as well, so you can note those down if you like. So questions now. So I did my best to sort of answer the questions that were provided in advance. There were a couple that I thought I kind of saved till the end. So I'll just get into those, and then we'll see how much time we have left for additional questions. One of the big questions that we have received is whether organizations looking for advice on whether they should or whether they can apply if they still have funding from last year. So our answer to this is it's kind of no different than normal. We're still going to assess applications case by case, as every organization's situation might be different. So some organizations might be sitting on funding for a program that just wasn't delivered. Some organizations may have been able to deliver some form or some portion of programming and may need only partial funding for the year. Some organizations might need the full amount, just like they normally would. So basically, we want you to tell us your situation as best you can, as that's going to help us to understand and assess your application the most accurately. If you have funding for your program, but you didn't use it, I guess we would say consider whether you need the funding for this year, or maybe a modified ask from what you normally ask for. Organizations will not be penalized in a future year if you decide not to apply this year, so that you shouldn't need to worry about that. And really our advice is to anyone applying to just tell us what you spent last year, what you were able to deliver last year, what you intend to deliver this year in the next 12 months, and the status of your gaming funds, if you still have gaming funds. If you have a lot of unspent gaming funds but are requesting your usual amount, just tell us why that full amount is needed, and how you're planning on spending it. Maybe you're planning to ramp things up considerably to make up for lost time. And you would do that, in your program description, as I mentioned, as well as the program budget that will detail what you're planning on doing for the next 12 years. For funding that was awarded last year, organizations do have that additional 12 months to spend the money. So you can spend that funding in this year as well. So check your notification letter to see when that 24-month period would have began for when you received that funding. For this year, we have gone back to our original policy of 12 months. So funding that you received this year, you will have 12 months. Last year, you have 24 months. So it'll probably take you to roughly the same amount of time, but you'll have that sort of leeway to figure out how you want to spend it. The other question that was asked was around reduction in participant numbers and a canceled season affecting your grant. So the short answer is no. As mentioned before, we will consider your normal participation levels when assessing your grant. So you can either provide this to us, or if you're a returning applicant, we'll look at your historical numbers as well. It would be probably helpful to include some of that historical context in your program description, just to let the analysts know kind of what normal looks like for you, as well as that factual account of what you did deliver over the last 12 months, like I said. We have also waived that 12-month previous delivery requirement, as I mentioned, for return applicants. So any of those postponements or cancellations in your programming won't affect your eligibility either. And then someone, I think, asked a question of whether a reduction in staff would affect their application. So, I guess what I would say to that is that your funding request should always reflect what your program budget indicates. So if your program budget has decreased because you're paying less in wages, this might just naturally mean that you request less in funding. But again, you know, ask for what you need based on what it will take for you to deliver your program. That's kind of our main takeaway. You know, you're putting together your programming for the year. If you need X amount of dollars, ask for X amount of dollars. You know, you know what you've got sitting in the bank, and what you're going to need to be able to successfully roll that out for the year. So I think that's our kind of general rule of thumb when giving advice on, you know, if people should apply and how much they should ask for. So hopefully that answers some of your questions. Otherwise, I think maybe I'll turn it over now. I know we're getting pretty tight on time. But yeah, Scott, I'll turn it over to you. And I'll turn my video on too.
Yeah, that's great. You answered a lot of the pre-submitted questions, so that is extremely helpful. One thing that came up a few times was if you were funded for one particular program, but it had to change due to COVID, are they able to move funding from one program that wasn't able to run to another program that was?
If it is an approved program, as in a program that they have applied for through our program, they can definitely move that funding around. If it were a program that we haven't assessed, or we did assess and we rendered that was ineligible, then no, they would have to hang on to the funding. But yeah, between approved programs, absolutely.
Okay, great. A couple questions about financial reporting. What's the best way to do that? Is there an approved form that they fill out? Is there somebody that they can contact about the best way to do that?
Yeah, so probably the best thing to do would be to look at those example financial statements on our website. Those are some pretty great examples of kind of standard ways of presenting that information to us. We as a branch can't sort of pre-look at applications before they're sent to us. It'd be great if we could, but then we'd have to do that for everyone, and we certainly don't have the staff for that. But the two organizations that I mentioned before, the BC Association of Charitable Gaming and those community charitable gaming associations, can get into the details with organizations and take a look at their financial statements before they send them in. So that's where I would go if you're kind of looking for that information and advice at a more detailed level.
Okay, great. And then a couple of questions that have been asked a few times in the chat on the definition of an elite athlete.
I don't think we have a definition of an elite athlete. It's more about programming that is specifically for elite athletes. So we do have programming that kind of spans the whole range and does support more of those high performance athletes, but it's more if it's specifically for elite athletes, as in, you know, your regular person. You know, if I wanted to go play soccer at a really high level, but I have no business doing so, which is true, by the way, I wouldn't be able to access that program. So it's that kind of programming that we're talking about.
Okay, and as far as organization eligibility, a few people were looking for clarification about registered charities versus nonprofits. Are both able to apply?
I'm not sure about the registered charity status. I would probably get them to get in touch with us. Like, organizations do not need to be incorporated under the Societies Act to apply for funding from us. However, most of our requirements are kind of in line with what those incorporated societies are doing anyway. But that's a good question, and I don't know the right answer to that. So I would encourage them to get in touch with me, and we can look into that a little bit further.
Okay, I'm just looking at some of the others to see if there was any. A couple of questions about in-kind contributions and how that can be reported.
Mm-hmm. Great question. So we have an example in-kind contribution summary on our website as well that kind of breaks down just what that is. But we And also we have an example on our website of the program financials that shows how that in-kind contribution would be represented. The way that we basically ask organizations is to, for volunteer labor, it can be up to $20 per hour that you can basically value that at. Otherwise, it's at the fair market value of whatever it might be donated, or if there's a professional accredited service like an accountant, whatever their sort of hourly rate would be. And the way that we ask that to be represented is both as an expense and as a revenue, so they cancel out, but at least that way we can see, you know, if we were to value those in-kind contributions at their sort of what it would cost out in the real world, we would see that was a more accurate representation of what it costs to run your program. We do have a lot more information on that in our guidelines, and those example documents, I think, will just kind of have that visual representation of what we typically like to see there.
Okay, great. I think we'll leave questions there. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and we went a couple minutes over. I know we started a couple minutes late, so apologies for that, everyone. But also just wanted to mention that the slide deck will be emailed out to everyone along with a recording of the webinar. So feel free to share that within your organizations. And Denise, Charlene, maybe I'll leave it to you for any final remarks.
Sure. Yeah, I'll just say, you know, please do get in touch if there are other questions that you didn't have an opportunity to ask, or if you have something more detailed and specific that you want to get into, I'm definitely happy to help. But yeah, I just want to say thank you for you guys for hosting this, and for everyone for coming and turning out. I think that's wonderful. Yeah, happy to be here, and thanks for your time, everyone.
Yeah, I'll just chime in quickly. I know that it's over the hour, but thank you so much, Denise, for coming and sharing all of this information and the process. And it certainly helps to clarify how best to access the funding, and you know, also to, you know, all the people on the call. And we know this has been a challenging year. We're so very grateful for all of the work that's being done at the community level to keep sport in our communities, and certainly this funding can help you know, sustain some of these programs. So thank you, Denise. It's very timely information, because we know that this is very valued funding, and we're very grateful to have you here and have this funding available to the amateur sport system. So thank you, Denise, and thank you everyone for joining us today. And by all means, reach out to us at Via Sport, and certainly to Denise and the team at the Community Gaming Grants branch for more information. Terrific. Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Scott. Bye for now.